as soon as you sit in sitting practice, then I'm sure you've noticed that the first thing you find is your thoughts, racing round and round inside your head, going off lists and things people have said to you and stuff like that. Songs is quite normal for me, to be honest. Crap songs, stuff. That's what the quiet mind does. It starts to fire off because that's what's happening all the time while you're active anyway. It's happening all the time because it's trying to interact with everything around you, and then as soon as you're still, you just become aware of it, and that's what's firing off inside your mind. So there's normally two processes that take place. First one is if we have, I don't know, what should we call it? Should we call it thoughts? It's not really thoughts though, is it? Because thoughts almost imply something intelligent. But what comes out of your quiet mind while you're sat in meditation is rarely intelligent. It's crap, isn't it? Everyone thinks you sit there and you get these profound insights. It's not true, is it? What goes through your head? Is it profound? A lot of the time it's not. It's just nonsense, isn't it? So the next thing you get on top of that is judgment. That's normally what happens afterwards. Because you start then observing. So who goes through this thought process? This is what I'm having tea for tomorrow. Why are you thinking about what you're having for tea tomorrow? You're supposed to be meditating. So then what you have is the second voice, the second aspect of a quiet mind that starts judging the first aspect of a quiet mind. And then half an hour later you realise you've been arguing with yourself. That's normal. That's what happens during sitting practice, right? If you haven't been through that, I'd be very surprised with the process. The problem is that if that starts to happen, what you have a tendency to do is want to then stop the mind. So then the next mindset that's normal is for people going, no, I've got to be quiet with my mind, I've got to shut my mind up. Then everybody, even though they know, you might have read, right, don't force, let them all float past like a cloud, which is a very nice analogy for what we do, but everyone says to force their mind to shut up. But what happens when you force is, remember, we're not talking about something intangible, we're talking about the energy, the substance that sits behind it with an alchemy. So the chi, the vibrational frequency behind your thought process, will contract, essentially. So what you do is you create condensing, a solidifying of that process by creating a clash. Yeah? As soon as I solidify something, then all it does is it goes deeper down into the system and then attaches onto the acquired mind. So by the very act of resisting, what you do is you strengthen those layers. Yeah? So that becomes the first challenge, and all you've done is create more stuff that you've then got to work your way through. So in fact your meditations become backwards. Yeah. So then the next thing that happens after this is you learn not to do that. You just sit and you just observe and what have you. And then gradually what happens underneath then is you find emotions. That's what normally has to happen, because underneath those thoughts there has to be there has to be emotion. There has to be an emotional energy behind everything. You can't have a thought without there being an emotion behind it. And then everyone tries to come up with mundane things like, right, picture and pencil sharpener or something like that, something that can't produce an emotional reaction. But actually it does. But that emotional reaction can be very, very small, right? It might be something you don't think of, but then if you think of something really extreme, dinosaur mauling its way through a playground or something like that, it might produce really strong, but that might produce really strong emotional reactions behind it. But it's all in a gradient, but there's still an emotional content to that thought process. The reason is because within Taoism, if this is congenital mind in here, okay, then that stillness operates according to the movement of 5 key components that are called the 5 spirits. And what they're discussing is there's 5 key energies that move around within that space to create potential for something to take place. What they do as they come out is they produce an energy, they produce a movement, a vibration out of that system, and those are the emotions, or the key categories of emotions that a human being can experience, or an animal, I suppose. These emotions then produce the energy that then transfers the thought from congenital nature through to acquired mind. So that's why everything has an emotional charge behind it, and it's starting to take place. So then your process of meditation is to move backwards through all this, arguing with yourself, forcing yourself there, and getting through into the emotional content that sits behind it. Yeah. What happens then is not, I'm not talking emotional reaction like, you start crying or something like that, that's not what I'm after. Instead what happens when you go in is you just have a little realization. You start to see, oh, that's why that happens. That's an emotional thing, that's the reason why that process comes. And gradually what you get is a a level of awareness starting to appear from within your practice. Now, the structure becomes important because that level of awareness on its own does nothing within a tradition like this, because it's an alchemical tradition. It's trying to find an energy to change, right? So if my structure is bad, okay, and I'm not assisting it by creating that right shape, then what will happen is I'll come in, right, go through that process, I get in, and oh, that's why that happens inside my mind, and then nothing changes, okay? It just stays exactly the same. You just have a realization of why you are the way you are, I guess. But if you can create a lightness, a moving from a dense through to less dense situation within your body, then what happens is as soon as that realization comes, that little bit of awareness is given to that energy, into that state, into that mind process, then what happens is it starts to disperse, because you're creating the potential for the energy, the emotional energy, which is dense, to then move upwards towards a higher spike, to where it starts to spread, essentially, and it starts to dissipate. After a while, you can actually experience this, because you have a thought, you have a process, you actually start to feel it, you see it, there's the energy moving in, and then you see it disperse, and then your body feels light, and then another thought pops in, because there's always another one, and that's the process that the mind starts to go through. The reason we want to sever these is because your emotion produces a thought, okay, produces a thought pattern, and everybody will start to gravitate towards a particular thought pattern. So somebody who has certain experiences, a certain life, will tend to then see everything from the point of view of anger, or frustration. Somebody who has another experience will tend to see everything from the point of view of woe is me, or something like that. It's really individual, but it depends on what your experiences are, and the more that happens, the more that starts to change the energy in your body, and that becomes your standpoint for everything that you experience, right? That becomes your platform through which you view life. As that then produces those thoughts then produce more emotions, okay, of the same type. So it starts to create a cycle, so that starts to cycle out of control, and that's why you get extreme sort of mental states, and that would turn into, in extreme cases, like just irrational rage in people, or like deep-seated depression and suicidal tendencies, and other people, there's sort of deviance from the center that makes the mind really, really hard to work with, yeah? Now, to try and do that just in a kind of exploring of the mind way, I think is quite challenging. But to simply sit and observe, form the correct shape, relax and use your body as a trigger to open everything up, I think it's much easier. Because actually, after a while, the very fact that you have mastered form and the ability to sit and create that movement from dense through to ethereal within the body, and a gentle awareness of what's taking place in your mind, naturally starts to disperse that energy, which then starts to change. So essentially, as a form of meditation, it's quite simple. You don't have to do anything. It does it all for you. All you have to do is study the body and then just observe. Gradually, as the mind starts to become stiller, because these starts to sever, then it pulls the mind back to a central state. That then changes the quality of the energy through your body. It makes the energy work a lot easier, because it will start change and then progression along a line. Do you understand that? Yeah? This is why the study of form is important.